if they do, triple exclamation point. Mixed message much? Our theme music was composed by BJ Liederman. Marketplace's executive producer is Nancy Fargali. Donna Tam is the executive editor. Neil Scarborough is the vice president and general manager. And I'm Amy Scott. Have a great weekend. We'll be back on Monday. This is APM.
We're a minute away from 7 o'clock on a Friday evening on your NPR station, News 87. You'll probably be pleased to know that for the most part, we are caught up on rainfall for this point in 2025. The official total yesterday at Bush Intercontinental, 1.3 inches, and that means our year-to-date rainfall is now a mere 0.2 of an inch below average. And our total for the first 9 days of May is about 1.5 inches above the month-to-date average, if you can keep track of all that in your head. We should know in a couple of weeks if the recent showers will ease the abnormally dry conditions in Waller, Fort Bend, and the western half of Brazoria County. We're about an hour away from sunset. Could see a shower or two before midnight. We'll have partly cloudy skies after that with a low of 65. Right now it's 80 here at your NPR station, KUHF Houston News 88.7, service of the University of Houston. I'm David Pittman. I'll be back with you Monday afternoon at 2 at 7 o'clock.
Pope Leo talks about this idea of consulting with the faithful, having their ideas sort of trickle up to the church and through big meeting with bishops and lay people.
I'm Michael Barbaro. That's coming up on The Daily from the New York Times.
The Daily is supported by Made in Cookware, partnering with chefs like Tom Colicchio to bring professional-grade cookware to restaurants and home kitchens. Their cookware can be found at madeincookware.com. And by This Is Uncomfortable, a podcast from Marketplace hosted by Rima Crace. You can hear stories about life and how money messes with it. New episodes available wherever you get your podcasts.
Live from NPR News in Washington, I'm Jack Speer. The Trump administration is expelling transgender troops from the military. NPR's Quill Lawrence reports it comes after the Supreme Court allowed a ban to be enforced while a legal challenge is playing out.
One of President Trump's first executive orders declared that trans troops were not fit to serve, though trans people have deployed to combat and served openly starting in 2016. The ban drew legal challenges, but the Supreme Court ruled that it can stand while those cases play out. Now, the Pentagon says about 1,000 openly trans service members will be removed, and medical records will be used to kick out other troops who have had a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. The total number of trans people in the military is believed to be under 5,000, about 0.2% of the force. Advocates say transgender Americans have served honorably and effectively and called the ban irreparably harmful to them and to U.S. security. Quill Lawrence, NPR News.
Retired Supreme Court Justice David Souter has died. The New Hampshire Republican became a favorite of liberals for his nearly 20 years on the bench, often voting with them on issues like abortion, church-state relations, freedom of expression, and the accessibility of federal courts. Souter died at his home in New Hampshire. He retired from the bench in 2009. Justice David Souter was 85 years old. The U.S. Postal Service's Board of Governors has picked an official at one of its competitors to lead the independent Federal Mail Agency. As NPR's Hansi Luang explains, the move comes as USPS, which is a financial supporter of NPR, faces an uncertain future under the Trump administration.
David Steiner, a former CEO of Waste Management, is set to leave the board of FedEx to start leading the U.S. Postal Service in July. In a statement, Steiner says he believes strongly in maintaining the Postal Service's role as an independent establishment of the executive branch. In recent months, the Trump administration has sparked concerns that it's determined to take over an agency that Congress set up to be independent decades ago. President Trump has suggested a, quote, form of a merger between the Commerce Department and the Postal Service, as well as privatizing USPS, which would likely reduce mail service in rural communities. The heads of the two letter carrier unions say they're concerned about the incoming Postmaster General's background at FedEx, which they fear could lead to USPS selling off the package side of its mail business and sidelining unions. Hansi Luong, NPR News, Washington.
Mexico says it is suing tech giant Google over its labeling of the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. Mexico's President Claudia Sheinbaum did not provide details during her daily press briefing today, but did confirm the lawsuit. Mexico's Foreign Relations Ministry had previously sent letters asking Google not to refer to the Mexican territorial waters as the Gulf of America. President Trump made the name change. However, many foreign leaders have continued to refer to the Gulf of Mexico, saying Trump's order only carries authority within the U.S. Stocks drifted to a mixed close on Wall Street today. The Dow was down 119 points. This is NPR. The Trump administration continues to send mixed messages in terms of the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. At one point, President Trump had seemed more in sync with Russian President Vladimir Putin, but now is openly accusing Russia of foot-dragging and ending its war against Ukraine. NPR's Joanna Kakissis reports Trump and Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky spoke this week.
According to Zelensky's office, it was a friendly phone call. It's the second positive conversation between these two recently. Of course, we remember that striking image of Trump and Zelensky sitting in an empty Vatican courtyard before Pope Francis's funeral. That was the first sign of a thaw in that frosty relationship. And based on what we can see and what we're hearing, they've moved on. Zelensky said in this latest conversation, he emphasized the need for a durable ceasefire that can be enforced.
President Trump has called for a 30-day unconditional ceasefire that, if refused, could result in the imposition of new sanctions on Russia. More trouble overnight at already problem-plagued Newark Airport, where for a period of time radar went out for a second time in 2 weeks. The Federal Aviation Administration says the radar at the facility in Philadelphia that directs planes in and out of the airport went dark for about 90 seconds just before 4 a.m. this morning. That's similar to an incident at the airport last month that led to hundreds of flights being either canceled or delayed as the FAA slowed traffic at Newark to ensure safety. Crude oil futures prices were higher amid some optimism over upcoming U.S.-China trade talks. Oil rose more than $1 a barrel today, settled at $61.01 a barrel in New York. I'm Jack Spear, NPR News in Washington.
Support for NPR comes from NPR stations. Other contributors include Eric and Wendy Schmidt through the Schmidt Family Foundation, working toward a healthy, resilient, secure world for all. On the web at theschmidt.org. This is NPR.
Hi, this is Jason Horowitz, the Rome Bureau Chief of the New York Times, and I'm here in St. Peter's Square, looking up at the roof of the Sistine Chapel, where cardinals are inside voting on who the next pope should be. Like everybody else, I'm looking at a chimney. So there's white smoke in the square, and I'm running back to file the story. But once again, white smoke, a new pope.
From the New York Times, I'm Michael Barbaro. This is The Daily. Today, the world's 1.4 billion Catholics now have a new pope. And for the first time, he's from America. It's Friday, May 9th. Jason, good evening.
Good evening, Michael.
As they say in Italy, habemus pub. Do I have that right?
Yeah, we don't say it all the time, just when we get a pope.
And it happened pretty quickly.
Yeah, it happened really quickly. It was the second day. A lot of people thought we were going to be in a long conclave. It seemed like they had a lot of new cardinals who needed to get to know each other, and wasn't very clear how long they would be in there. The idea was that if it was as quick as it was, as it's been actually pretty often, going back to the 1930s, it would be someone who was a front runner, someone we had been hearing a lot about. And that's not exactly how it shook out.
Well, Jason, when you and I last spoke, the evening that Pope Francis had died, you laid out for us quite clearly the stakes around the question of who would succeed Francis. Would it be a pope in the mold of Francis, who embodied his desire for inclusion over rules and religious purity, or might it be a pope who represented, as you put it, these powerful conservative forces and traditional instincts that were so frequently at odds with Francis? Did it feel like that was the guiding principle over this process?
Yeah, I think that dynamic was at play in the conclave. But I also think that there was something else going on. I think that the cardinals saw all these people come to Francis's funeral. I think that they realized that they had had a pope who for 12 years really put the Catholic Church on the world stage. I think that they started thinking, do we really want a bureaucrat? Do we really want someone who might suck the air out of this? And don't we really want, and this was what was most important to Francis maybe, a pastor. The pastor to guide the church, and whether it be a priest in the parish, a bishop in a city, or, as it turns out, maybe a pope in Rome.
Well, with that principle and influence seemingly guiding the process, it sounds like, Francis, a bit from the grave, hanging over all this, tell us about the mechanics of this election process, the unique rules around it, and what we understand happened behind closed doors.
Well, in full disclosure, we sort of know nothing because, in a way, it's I like to think of it as sort of the most beautifully frescoed black box in the world. The Sistine Chapel, when the cardinals go in there to elect the Pope, we don't know what the dynamics really are. We don't know what the votes are.
But we know the process as prescribed.
Yeah, so the cardinals basically go into the Sistine Chapel and they take an oath of absolute secrecy. And at a certain point, the doors close after one of the prelates says, "Exit omnes," everybody out. And everyone who's not a voting cardinal, whether it be members of the choir or bishops, everybody starts filing out and the doors close.
And how many cardinals are voting and how many votes are needed?
So is 133 voting cardinals entered into the Sistine Chapel. There were two guys who didn't make it in because they weren't feeling well. And of those 133, you need 89 votes. You need 2/3 to become Pope. So that seems simple enough, but 2/3, a majority in a college that represents the entire world where not everyone is speaking Italian, which is supposed to be the working language of the church, which probably slowed things down the first night. Anyway, it's very difficult to hit that threshold. And on the first day, which was Wednesday, they have one vote, and we kind of expected that it would be inclusive, and in fact it was. And the way that the church shows that is that black smoke starts billowing out of a chimney atop the Sistine Chapel. But when they leave the Sistine Chapel, they're still sequestered. They still have a vow of secrecy, but they aren't taking an oath of silence. They're allowed to talk to each other. And that's when the politicking starts, right? So they have seen in that first vote who's a strong candidate, who maybe is softer than they expected. And that's the really interesting part. And, it could be over the cafeteria table. It could be people visiting one another's rooms. It could be hallway discussions. But I think what is happening inside is candidates are realizing whether or not they have the votes or not. And that's when coalitions start building, because a candidate who thought maybe he could be Pope realizes he won't be Pope. And so what does he do with his support? Does he want to throw it to a candidate that he supports to block somebody he doesn't want? So that's when all the regional dynamics, all the political dynamics, all the theological dynamics really come together, and it's all out of view. So they came back the next morning, and we came back the next morning, and they started voting again, and we started looking at the chimney again. And pretty early in the day, we saw black smoke, which meant that, again, they had not found their candidate.
Mm-hmm.
But once you realize it's white, you realize that something momentous has happened. And then a few minutes later, the bell of St. Peter's Basilica starts tolling. And marching bands start surrounding the square. And the Swiss Guards start marching up. And then the curtains part, and a cardinal dressed in red comes out onto the balcony. And the first thing he says is,
Habemus Papam.
Habemus Papam, which means we have a pope. And then, speaking in Latin, he says the name of that pope.
Dominum Robertum Franciscum, Sancte Romane Ecclesiae, Cardinalem Prevost.
And for the first time, we hear the words Robert Francis Prevost.
Qui sibi nomen imposuit Leonem decimum quartum.
And it's revealed that he's taken the name Pope Leo XIV, and all of a sudden we have an American Pope. And then a few minutes later, the new Pope steps out onto the balcony, and he is speaking Italian.
La pace sia con tutti voi.
And he addresses the crowd, and he says, "Peace be upon you."
Grazie a Papa Francesco.
And he makes it clear that he sees himself in the continuum of Francis. He names Francis twice.
Come essere una chiesa missionaria.
He talks about wanting a missionary church, and that's something also very much in the mold of Francis. He wants pastors. He wants a church that goes out there. He wants a church that's close to people.
Tutti coloro che hanno bisogno.
He talks about something which to secular ears probably doesn't mean anything at all, but it's something called synodality, which is this idea of consulting with the faithful, having their ideas sort of trickle up to the church and through big meetings with bishops and lay people. And so that was Francis's major vision for how the church worked. And the fact that Pope Leo said that on the balcony was taken as a huge sign that that was going to continue.
Adesso e nell'ora della nostra morte. Amen.
So by the end of his speech, everyone in that piazza who was hungry for more Francis, who wanted to make sure that the church continued to be inclusive, who wanted that pastoral sense that Francis cared about so much, everyone who wanted that to keep going felt like that legacy was perhaps protected. But I don't think we got another Francis. I think that there are differences here. I think that they're not only two different people with two different backgrounds, but I think that maybe they have different ideas about the world and maybe the church. So that's why we're all looking at his life story, we're looking at his career, we're looking at his path in the church, trying to figure out if there are clues to how he might actually govern as Pope Leo. We're trying to figure out if in fact past his prologue here.
We'll be right back.
The Daily is supported by Bitwarden Password Manager for Business, built to turn short-term security goals into long-term success. Available at bitwarden.com. Innovative, immersive, and skillfully investigated, The Daily brings listeners today's stories as only the New York Times can report them. For more on today's episode, go to nytimes.com/thedaily. Distribution of The Daily is made possible by American Public Media. APM produces and distributes programs that inform and inspire, entertain, and engage audiences everywhere.
This is News 88.7. I'm Christopher Kimball from Milk Street Radio. One day, editor Judith Jones was handed an unwieldy stack of paper entitled French Recipes for American Cooks. She knew she had a hit on her hands. The problem was convincing everyone else.
In 1959, there was no space for cookbooks in literary publishing.
The unlikely origin of mastering the art of French cooking, that's coming up this week on Mill Street Radio from PRX.
Sunday afternoon at 1 o'clock here on News 88.7.
Kay Barry says he's been the class clown ever since he was elected back in high school.
Class of 1965. It was a fair election, too. But no matter what you hear, no matter what people say.
But in his new book, one of America's most loved humorists says there's also been a lot of heartbreak and lessons learned along the way. You can hear that Saturday on Weekend Edition and news about the new Pope from NPR News.
Saturday morning at 7 o'clock.
The world's 1.4 billion Catholics now have a new pope. And for the first time, he's from America. So Jason, tell us about the life story, the career, and the path through the church of this new pope and how past might be prologue when it comes to what his papacy might look like.
Well, the first and, in a way, most interesting thing about Pope Leo is that he was born in Chicago. And for a long time, the idea of having an American pope was just a non-starter. So to see Birthplace Chicago, Illinois, on the biography of the Vatican website right now for the Holy Roman Pontiff is sort of stunning.
Jason, just remind us why it would be seen as a non-starter to have an American pope.
Sure. Well, there's a long tradition of the idea that it's just impossible to have an American pope, first because of geography. And once America became a superpower, there was really a feeling, especially after World War II, that you couldn't put so much power in the hands of one country. You couldn't have the major superpower on earth, the largest economy, the country that was delivering the Marshall Plan and sculpting the global order. You couldn't also have someone from that country also be the head of the Roman Catholic Church.
That's fascinating.
So for a long time, it was just seen as concentrating too much power in the hands of one country. But now we have Pope Leo XIV, who has clearly broken that taboo.
Well, tell us more about his American roots. You said he's from Chicago.
Yeah, so he was born in Chicago in 1955, and in a way, he's got a very American story. His father was of French and Italian descent. His mother was of Spanish descent. And it's clearly a very religious family. He enters the seminary pretty soon in his adolescence, and he's drawn to the Augustinian Fathers, which is a religious order. And he ends up at Villanova University in Pennsylvania. So, it's also sort of stunning, very American when you think that the Pope went to Villanova, which a lot of people know from March Madness,
Right. So what else do we know about him?
So, like a lot of bright young things in the church, he is sent off to Rome, where he studies theology, and then he studies canon law. But then his story sort of changes, and this sort of very American story takes a more international turn. And he's told this story before.
I think the part of ministry that most shaped my life was Peru. I was there for over 20 years, about 12 years as an Augustinian, doing parish work, pastor.
In 1985, Prevost is sent to Peru as a missionary, and that really changes his life.
Just can only say how gifted I feel because of what I gained from my years working in Peru. And I hope that every priest can say that about wherever he worked.
And he ends up taking Peruvian citizenship. He's very much, sees himself as part of South America as much as North America.
Another way, perhaps, in which he is very much like Pope Francis.
Yeah, I think that's right. Pope Francis really was shaped by his experience in Argentina, and the brand of Catholicism there was something that I think that Francis saw himself a little bit, perhaps, in Prevost, and that's one of the reasons that he brought him to Rome. Francis really believed that what he really needed to do was to bring people in who saw the world the way he saw the world, and that's where Prevost came in.
Being in leadership in the church is another formative experience.
In 2015, he appointed him bishop, in Peru, but he also ends up bringing them back to Rome. And in 2023, he ends up heading up the Office for Bishops, which is this major job inside the Vatican, which is in charge of all the bishops all across the world.
He called me, and specifically because he didn't want someone from the Roman Curia to take on this role. He wanted a missionary. He
entrusts him with not just the bureaucracy, but the pastors all around the world, right? The people who are actually going to be, running dioceses, the people who are going to be, picking which priests are in parishes.
So clearly Francis played a big role in his rise. How much do his views genuinely overlap with those of Francis?
So I think what's clear is that Pope Leo has many similar views to Francis, especially on issues that really matter right now, like, for example, migration. I think that it's pretty clear that Pope Leo is going to be a champion of migrants in much the same way that Francis was. On social issues, I think he's pretty much in the Catholic mainstream. So I think that what we can expect from him along those lines is someone who stands up for, opposition to gay marriage and birth control, the sort of usual things that, Catholic conservative would do. But we really don't know what Pope Leo is going to be like. Just because Cardinal Prevost held certain views, a lot of things can just change. And it's going to be fascinating to watch. Pope Francis had a really antagonistic relationship with the United States. At certain points, he almost seemed hostile to it. He wasn't a fan of its style of capitalism. He thought that the Bishops' Conference in the United States was sort of out to get him at times. Pope Leo is from Chicago, right? So it's just going to be fascinating to see how he navigates all of this, because the United States is deeply important for the Roman Catholic Church. I think maybe one of the reasons that Pope Leo is Pope right now is because the Church might be able to address some of its financial difficulties with greater contributions from big donors in the United States. That said, he also is very much in the mold of Francis. He might find a more diplomatic way, but I think that especially dealing with the political sort of landscape of the United States, he is going to find places where he is in deep disagreement with the current administration. And, it's going to be fascinating to see how he navigates that. It's also going to be interesting to see if his Americanness, if his nationality is used against him by the American administration, because perhaps he seems less foreign, perhaps he seems less special because he's one of ours. So there's a fear, I think, within the Church that he might be drawn into political fights that popes don't want to be drawn in, and I think he's going to be very reluctant to be drawn into that. I think what he wants, and this is especially from, what he said out on the balcony, I think he really sees himself possibly being a bridge, and perhaps a bridge back to America and to the bishops there, and maybe even to the administration there, just to say, well, let's lower the temperature. Let's see if we can work together.
That's fascinating, because earlier in this conversation, you suggested that for so long, the thinking was that there couldn't be so much power concentrated in America. And now we have a pope who wants to be a bridge to America, back home to America. That marks a really big change.
Yeah, and I think it also reflects the way the Church sees the world a little bit. I don't think that they see Leo as an American. I don't think nationality is what they're looking at. I think that they see him as someone who has this deep experience in the things that they care about, right? It's not where you're from, it's what you've done in a way. He's sort of checked all the boxes, but I think the one that's most important is that he has sort of the blessing of Pope Francis. It might be a posthumous blessing at this point, but for followers of Francis, I think when Leo stepped out onto the balcony and when he spoke in a language that they understood to be the language of Francis, they felt much more comfortable than perhaps if somebody else had stepped out there as Pope.
Well, Jason, thank you very much.
Thank you, Michael.
The Daily is supported by Progressive Insurance, helping protect small businesses and the owners that run them. Whether a plumber, accounting business, or restaurant, Progressive can help with over 30 customizable coverages. Online quotes available in as little as 6 minutes at progressivecommercial.com. Innovative, immersive, and skillfully investigated. The Daily brings listeners today's stories as only the New York Times can report them. For more on today's episode, go to nytimes.com/The Daily.
The Daily is powered by the journalism of the New York Times and is distributed by APM, American Public Media. You can go deeper into the stories you hear on The Daily at nytimes.com/The Daily. That's it for The Daily. I'm Michael Barbaro. See you on Monday.
Houston Public Media brings to you PBS World, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week on TV 8.6. Experience the personal connection behind the headlines with programming devoted to telling stories that humanize complex issues. PBS World helps us understand the movements, conflicts, and cultures that connect us all. PBS World on TV 8.6 and online at HoustonPublicMedia.org.
You count on Houston Public Media because you understand how important a free press is to a healthy society.
We're not chasing ratings. We're not owned by a corporation. We're here to inform you with facts, context, and clarity.
When you give today, you're helping protect journalism that serves you, not a political agenda or a bottom line.
Support this public service now at HoustonPublicMedia.org/donate or call 888-909-0887.
Welcome to Parrot Politics, where we prepare you for your next political conversation. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, a political science professor at the University of Houston.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghouse, also a political science professor here at the University of Houston. Thanks for hanging out with us and talking politics. We're going to deviate a little bit this week, Geronimo, from our usual kind of coverage of state and national politics and talk about a deep subject that we, of course, care a lot about, and it's really important. That's President Trump's first 100 days. We're a little late on this, but we wanted to kind of take a step back because there's so much happening, and it's so critical that we understand this in the context of the rest of presidential history that we wanted to take kind of one full episode and work through it. So Trump's shock and awe presidency is 100 days and maybe 2 weeks past, but it's important for us to really kind of think through all the implications to it. But before we talk about Trump and the specifics of his second term, let's talk about why we think of 100 days as a reasonable barometer for presidential success.
Nobody knows.
This is a mystery.
No, I mean, I think that first 100 days is important because it's just represents a symbolic and practical window for new presidents to set the tone of their administration. It's a honeymoon period where they can push forward major policy initiatives and have these political momentum from the election, right? And obviously, it's I guess that would be the context in which political capital is at its highest moment. It has agenda-setting power, and it's just historically speaking, it's also when FDR had and used the first 100 days to basically reshape the government back in 33 to combat the Great Depression.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, and like so many things in presidential history, it's all about FDR. And the reason we think of 100 days is because that was the kind of benchmark that FDR set, and he had a whirlwind of activities, executive orders, legislation, just kind of cornering the Democratic Party to his ends. Donald Trump has done some of these things, which we can talk about, but it's really an FDR thing. But the 100 days is kind of an arbitrary mark in a way, right?
Right.
It's like how we ask, like during the NFL Combine, for the players to run the 40-yard dash. Like, it's a lagging indicator of how good you're going to be as an NFL player.
Right.
The 100 days is simply kind of one measure, but it's symbolic, and I think you're exactly right about that. Like, the base wants to be satisfied immediately, and that kind of immediacy is something that we see presidents really trying to embrace, right? The faster they can do things, the more likely it is they can appease the base and sort of prove that they've done the right thing. The problem is there's a risk there, right? As politics becomes more competitive and as partisanship becomes more prominent, it's harder for presidents to get things done. So increasingly, they're relying on kind of unilateral power to do that, and sometimes kind of their own rhetoric, which at the end of the day may not amount to much. And so that's really kind of the conundrum that the kind of President Trump feels here, right? So presidents try to act under the guise of unilateral action where it looks like they're doing a lot, but in some cases, there's actually not a lot of changes, or changes that can't be kind of quickly undone. So that's the real issue for them. And of course, because voters' attention span is so short, there's a kind of goal here for presidents to try to, make sure they can kind of push things as quickly as possible. But let's talk about President Trump in particular.
Okay.
We'll talk about kind of what grade we might give them. We're in grading season right now, doing finals and, kind of sending off grades. So maybe we'll kind of have that as a point of discussion. But at least at the offset, to me, Donald Trump is like an REO Speedwagon song. It's constantly in a state of breakup with the American people. There's this constant kind of friction. In this case, it's about the economy, or it's about immigration, or it's about just the general kind of separation of power story. So he's always in breakup, and every REO Speedwagon song, in my opinion, is about breakup. So we've officially become a 80s stan podcast, but that to me is like the kind of role that we're seeing here with the American people. Donald Trump, this just seems like fighting so many battles on so many levels, engaging in this kind of grudge agenda, which, has its limits politically. At some point, the voters who aren't kind of the most committed voters in the, right or left are going to say, like, what are we really doing here? And so that's the question to you, is like, how is it that this is really playing for voters in the first 100 days?
Uncertainty.
Yeah.
I think that...
is that what he wants, or this is like just a sort of accident?
I think it's an accident. I think President Trump's agenda is extremely ambitious. In a sense, whether people agree or do not agree with his political agenda, and in terms of public policy, is extremely ambitious.
Right.
So I think you have to look at it from, I guess, a two-tier perspective. The first one is the core principles and try to extract the politics out of it, one way or the other.
Wow, that would be quite the surgical feat, my friend.
It would be the surgical feat, but it's the basic premise of perhaps going back to an era where we had industrial protectionism, in which we're talking about the 1970s,
yes,
right? In terms of having your own manufacturing, consuming what you produce, and basically isolating yourself from the rest of the world. And it has a very American ethos in terms of being, for example, separated by two big oceans, and having that position of being isolated from the world and just say, like, you know what, I'm going to do my thing. I don't care what you do. You deal with your problem. So historically, and I guess substantively, that's an issue. The problem with that is that we cannot implement such a, for example, an industrial policy nowadays. I agree in the sense that, yes, manufacturing should be something here. But again, the question is, are the younger generations willing or wanting to work on manufacturing?
That's a great question. And is the American people, are the American people willing to wait for that to happen? Right?
And that's
the real question.
Absolutely.
And I think the president thinks yes. And so I asked the question deliberately about whether this uncertainty was designed to be this way. I think you're right that it wasn't necessarily designed this way, but it definitely is a byproduct of this way of going about things, where it's like impossible for it to be able to be kind of structurally made clear at the outset, right? And for people to understand not only step 1, but also step 10. It could take 5 or so years, and more in some cases. The thing to me is that President Trump has remade the federal government. And he's done so in a way that is in some sense durable and in some sense not that durable. He's redefined the scope of executive power. He's tested into 5 areas, which could reshape the separation of powers functions. He's targeted his perceived political enemies. Specifically, he's killed Temu, so no more cheap goods for you from China, my friend. Sorry. He's saved TikTok, sort of. Maybe we'll see how that plays out. He's banned plastic straws. He released an image of himself as the Pope. Yeah, it's a bizarre combination of kind of politics, policy that is definitely like emerging in this kind of muddy mess. In his first 100 days, he's tried to do everything all at once. That's really hard to do, and I think we talked about this a second ago, right? That like the sort of sense for presidents is that we should do all of this all at once. Yeah, that's not the best strategy, right? You've got 4 years, and although of course you punctuate this by elections, but you do have to have this sort of set so that you're pacing yourself well, and they really haven't paced themselves that well. So if you look at the specifics, there are storm clouds that are gathering, right? His numbers, which we'll talk about in a few minutes, are less strong than they have been, right? Even on issues like immigration and the economy, he was seen to be the best choice in the election, and as he started the presidency, are now kind of below what Joe Biden was when he started. That is definitely a potential problem. Of course, the notion, the specter of there being this recession because of the trade wars is another kind of looming liability. So with all this context, I ask you kind of what grade would you give President Trump? Before you answer, Tommy Tuberville, who was the senator from Alabama, said that he gives the president an A+. Didn't hesitate. Okay. UH won't let us give A+, right? Yeah. He gives A's or A-. Yeah, and then you can get a B+, B-. Yeah. Are we talking about lower than that? Where are you putting him?
I would put him in an incomplete. Incomplete, and incomplete means that he started his assignments, but the semester is, or these 100 days are done, and the assignments are not completed. There's indication that there's work, but it has not fully materialized. Right. So my grade is just an incomplete.
Well, and at the university they give you a year to complete it. So like it's still a pretty tight time horizon. Maybe we give them 4 years to do it.
I mean,
and I think that makes sense, right? Because like we said, the more you can do to set yourself up for success down the road, the better your policy outcomes will be. But that's a tough call. I'd give him like a kind of meaty part of the curve right now, like a C, because not so much because of what he's accomplished or that it's been good or bad, but that this is sort of how we think about presidents and their actions, right? They have to be able to structurally kind of contain what they're interested in doing. They have to be able to maintain their executive power while also maneuvering it in ways that makes their policy outcomes more comfortable. This is something that he's done a little bit, right? He definitely has kind of set that up, right? It's like you set the jab up so that you can use the jab to set up your cross, right? Like as a boxing analogy, we're still kind of seeing the early rounds here. So I think that'll definitely be something that he will be successful at. But the sort of setup to that is really worth noting. But as it is now, there's still a lot of kind of incompleteness. And so just some of the numbers, I think, make this clear. Yep. The number of unilateral orders has far exceeded even what FDR did, 142 executive orders. And if you add in memos, which are just kind of agency rule promulgation, or proclamations, which are just sort of findings of fact, which do have triggers in other legislation, you see that basically that's about 200 plus unilateral orders. The problem with unilateral orders is that they can be easily done, right? Yes. All the next president has to do is to come in and say, whatever happened before Executive Order 2118, reverse it. It's done. That's not a durable policy change. And so, like I said earlier, like you need to be able to manufacture something here. And if you just kind of compare this to the number of bills signed into law, Donald Trump has 5. And that is going to compare to, say, Joe Biden at 11, and even Donald Trump at 30 during his first administration. So he's well below where he was. And I guess my question is, like, why? Why isn't it the case with majorities in both houses? He controls the Republican Party. The momentum was definitely in his favor. Why is it the case that he's governing by executive order instead of by legislation?
I guess the answer to that question, I think, is the urgency. Yeah. So he cannot wait for the legislative process to go forward. One. Mm-hmm. Number 2, I guess it's a way of the underlying political outcome that he's expecting, in the sense of absorbing and having this unilateral power to control the executive and be basically the CEO of the United States, and the CEO says, we're going to do this thing, and that thing gets done. So that's 2. And then number 3 that I think is extremely important is, yes, the Republican Party has majorities in the houses, but the Republican Party is not a unified Republican Party.
Which is a real trick, right? Yeah.
And the fact that you have so slim of a margin to pass legislation, and you have 2, 3, maybe 4 or 5 Republicans that say, I don't know, then it could stall everything.
Right.
So if you anticipate that, and I'll give it to President Trump and his legislative team, is like, we don't have the votes, forget about the votes, use this strategy, and let's get it done.
Yeah, and I think it makes total sense, right? This is a kind of made-for-TV presidency in a good way, because it promotes sort of the centrality of executive power, which presidents have used for a very long time to make their cases. But it also, of course, highlights the fragility of the executive, where if you try to just govern by tweet alone, it's not going to work. So underscoring what you're saying here, the president has far exceeded the number of tweets and words posted on Social Truth and Twitter than any president in history, right? 4,000 plus words a week on Truth Social. That's nearly 70% more than during his first term, and dramatically more than his predecessors, who averaged about 400. So he's really making this a kind of public presidency in a way that the framers did not intend, but that the administration and the executive branch has grown over time. And I think that the fact that he is confronting these political problems definitely is going to be the trickiest thing for him. But I think that if you look at the way it's going, when there's been a close call, he has been able to work with the Speaker and with the Senate to be able to get what he wants.
Right.
We're still negotiating through budget deals. There's still lots of legislation they want to pass that they might not get passed. But this is really the moment where he has to flex his executive muscle. And the question is, are all these things he's doing, are all the social media posts, are all of the bluster, with other countries, all of the sort of trade wars, unilateral powers, leading to the point where he can just tell the Republican Party what he wants? That's something that it took most presidents a really long time to get to. I think about Reagan and the way that he was able to kind of administer his executive authority and use his presidential leverage to his positive ability, to his policymaking ability. That was a tough call, because they had much more heterogeneous ideological distribution then than there is now. Now it's a lot easier to kind of coordinate people and Republicans, that is. So is it the case that you think that all this is leading to the point where he can lead the party in an effective way, so that in the future, after 100 days, we're going to get to the point where he can just say, this is what I want, everyone pass this, and 2 weeks later, it's signed and sealed?
No.
It doesn't work like that.
No, I mean, it doesn't work like that, because when you're thinking about the Republican Party, especially in Congress, and also applies to Democrats, every single member of Congress, every single member of the Senate, they are rational politicians seeking re-election.
Right.
When you have that, is tricky, because when you look and confront reality, and when you look, for example, at public opinion polls, the president's approval has gone very, very, very badly in the past weeks.
And popular presidents don't lead as effectively. That we know from political science.
Correct. So when you look at the issues, the only issue that is above water is immigration, and has only declined 0.2% or something like that in terms of approval. But the economy, tariffs, etc., have taken a deep dive into negative territory, around 15, 20% lack of approval. And that makes, or I assume would make wonder, these individuals are in Congress saying, Jesus, but my constituents don't want or have not seen, for example, the economy to the levels that we promised we were going to get them. And we have seen those things in town halls where Republicans go and they get yelled at and so on and so forth.
The pictures of protesters being carried out, or people who are disagreeing or asking questions in some cases, getting carried out. It feels authoritarian in a way, and that's the kind of alarms that are going off, right? That basically, the president is using the executive capacity in ways that are not intended and or that are unconstitutional. That is, again, sort of the underscoring the fragility of what the president's trying to do. So you can govern by tweet. You can make it clear that you think that this should happen, and we're going to take Canada, and we're going to take the fight to these other kind of sort of enemies, perceived and real. But that doesn't mean it's real, and that doesn't mean people are going to believe it, or that Congress is going to believe it. So to me, a lot of the bluster about kind of Trump maybe running for a third term is just that, right? It's just a way to make sure that people don't see him as a lame duck, because at some point, Trumpism will fade. Donald Trump's power as a politician will no longer be the potency as potent as it is now. So that is going to be a conundrum that he is going to face sooner than later. So I think it makes total sense then to understand the first 100 days in the context of him trying to do as much as possible, because he knows that the clock is ticking. I mean, for me, he didn't need to have the picture of him getting almost assassinated in the Oval Office. He needs a clock. And the clock countdown is the days until his presidency is over.
But not even that. Is the midterm election.
Right. Are Republicans worried about Trump? I mean, it's only been 100 days again. This is all just sort of in the context of it being very early, but are Republicans worried about this?
I think that they should be worried about this, and especially because you're starting to see in the Democratic Party some voices that are speaking louder and louder and louder, saying we should primary out these Democrats that have been there forever. And that is going to put pressure into that and pressure into action. And also for Republicans, that means that not very likely they're going to deliver on these very basic things. Tariffs, for instance, if you're looking for a new vehicle right now, a car, a truck, Jesus, I mean, if you have the cash right now, you go and pull the trigger and get your new truck. But if you don't have it and you were thinking, well, maybe I'm going to change it or get a new car in a year or something like that, he's like, but I don't know what's going to happen.
You're talking my language. It hits me in my wallet. I need a new car.
Me too.
I love beer. So all of a sudden it's more expensive than it was.
It is.
And this is a small fraction of kind of how people perceive this, but you're exactly right. The economy has been an advantage he's lost. And more than the fact that people are distrustful of the economy or don't like the tariffs and the fact that prices haven't come down, these are all logistical issues. To me, the biggest problem is the following, and that is that for the president now, the polling indicates people see the economy as his responsibility. And the reason that's important is not just for some functional reason. It's because politically he can no longer blame the Biden administration for the problems. Whereas in principle, he could, right? The economy doesn't move fast enough that you can say now you own it. But his actions and the way he's sort of just controls the kind of political narrative essentially gives him this sense and sort of encourages people to believe that he does control it. And so he's a kind of victim of his own success here in a way, right? Where he's always talking about this kind of trade balance. He's always talking about how he's going to bring prices down. He's talking about the way we're going to fix the economy. Those are all things that people watch him and say, oh, okay, well, then do it. And if he doesn't do it, I think to your point about how Republicans are worried about this, it could be a real liability for them going forward. But there are lots of promises he's made, some of which haven't really come to fruition. Let's talk about Doge. Let's talk about Elon Musk, right? He of the chainsaw and of the electric car. That process, of course, started out really hot, right? To the point where even places like Texas were having new committees that were formed on the Doge of Texas committee, right? This is sort of a phenomenon that took off, but the actual findings, the actual savings are actually really small. And so I'm wondering if this has the kind of resonance with the voters that in the first 100 days that he intended it to have.
Well, I think that issue is very particularly very muddy and very cloudy and very, I guess, esoteric to some extent. To really understand the federal budget, you need to have a lot of knowledge and spending a lot of time on research.
Yes. Which the American people love to do.
Exactly. Right.
Closely monitoring what agencies are getting what. But we shouldn't expect them to do that, right?
Oh, absolutely not.
That's why I think that the Doge story is in some ways better than the actual outcome, right?
Oh, yes, absolutely.
And the numbers are kind of replete, right? They say we're going to find $200 billion. They find maybe $5. Look, $5 billion is nothing to sniff at. This is definitely a kind of cost-saving measure. It has to be codified by Congress. But again, that gets to the point where they have to get Congress to agree. And some of these cuts are pretty intense to the point where voters may say, yikes.
Yeah, I mean, Doge started with $2 trillion. Then maybe 1 trillion, and now some independent analysis by the Partnership for Public Service, that is in theory a non-partisan organization, said that in reality the $160 billion that Doge has found, at least kind of documented, is going to cost around $135 billion because reduced services, lost revenue, so on and so forth. So, as you say, it's a great idea, But unfortunately, there is not enough meat to say, oh, yeah. But now, as you say, $5 billion is $5 billion. I don't have them.
No, and again, it's like it's an expectations question, right?
Correct.
And if you play into the notion that the first 100 days has to be the best of the days, then you fall into the trap where you try to do everything all at once. And if you promise you're going to do $2 trillion and it comes up to be $5 billion, if you promised $10 billion and you found $5 billion, people will be like, oh, great. But if you promised way over promised and you under deliver, then that's, I think, mechanically a real problem. So again, it's the problem is the president's falling into this trap of like saying this is kind of where we're ending, right? Your term doesn't end after 100 days. It really only just begins. Let's talk about the judiciary, because that's been a big kind of conundrum for a lot of voters. It's sometimes called the third branch of government. Gotcha. If you look at the Constitution, it's like that much, right? Just a little bit, but nevertheless pretty important. Donald Trump remade the federal judiciary in his first term.
Yes.
This still needs to be discussed and written about more than it has been. And the second term hasn't been as successful. The Biden administration and the Democrats got, of course, wind of this. They know President Trump's going to get reelected, or by the time he did, they had to rush through a bunch of judgeships. They did so. In his first term, Donald Trump had about 100 judicial vacancies at the start. Now he's got about 40, still a lot, but he's going to have to fight through a bunch of issues, right? So in the last couple of weeks, we've seen federal judges block enforcement of executive orders requiring proof of citizenship to vote, blocking federal funding denials to sanctuary cities, sort of battering the president's policies when it comes to deportation, blocking the president's plan to cut funding for K through 12 schools, diversity programs, and on and on and on. So again, not that durable, right? And some of these may go, but at the end of the day, it seems to me like these things are still being fought over, and after 100 days, the president doesn't have any tangible outcome to show for it, except just the pugilistic spirit, which as an executive is something that we said is important. So what do you make of the kind of political fights as they traverse the legal agenda?
Well, there's two things. One can be, this pugilistic style that you mentioned, and picking up fights with every single federal judge. But I think the real issue here is how the judiciary is going to survive these. If the judiciary says to the Trump administration, hey, Trump administration, you cannot do that. And the Trump administration say, hey, I don't care what you say, I'm going to still doing it.
We're doing it anyway,
it gets to a point that is like, kind of like, wait, what? And the Supreme Court has given President Trump some wins and not other, and some, I guess, loose cases.
Some temporary losses.
Right.
But all of it's temporary, right?
All is
still
temporary.
Having to fight these things out, right?
Yes. And eventually, again, this thing, especially when it moves through the federal judiciary system, take a long time.
Takes a long time.
And can take years in some cases.
No, and I mean, I think that's what they want, is like you set the stage early, then you fight it out politically, right? If you don't get the outcome you want legally, then you can go to the voters and say, hey, look, they're in our way. We should have our approach. And to me, that's one thing where he has been successful, is changing the culture, right? I mean, all of the DEI stuff has come down off all of these sort of federal websites. The Democrats are in disarray. The kind of resistance that happened in the first term didn't really happen. So, big tech, universities, law firms, foreign countries are all kind of, bending the knee. So that's a big change. And for a president, that's a pretty successful outcome for 100 days.
Well, absolutely, because the culture is going to be something that is going to stay for a couple of years or decades or so on. And now the turn would be for the Democrats to try to redefine what's going to be their culture. But obviously, that is something that we're going to be keeping track in the next couple of weeks. I'm Jerónimo Cortina.
And I'm Brandon Roninghouse. The conversation keeps up next week.